Well, thank you very much, Felicia, and good morning to everyone. I'm humbled to be here and to take on this task and opportunity of this opening session, which is entitled Investing in Regenerative Economies, Equity, and Justice. And before I introduce the esteemed panel, I would just like to give a little background about environmental justice. And Shalonda mentioned persistence, energy, and our title. And in our title, we talk about regenerative. And I want to point out that persistence, energy, and regeneration is the foundation of the environmental justice movement. If we go back in history, and we know that we're in the 30th anniversary year of the People of Color Environmental Justice Leadership Summit that occurred in 1991 in Washington, D.C., when I was still in graduate school. And I want to acknowledge that we are here on the shoulders of people, regular people, community-based organizations that pushed, and took on their civic responsibility and fomented the environmental justice movement. I want to call a couple names that are just representative of persistence, energy, and regeneration. I woke up this morning and I realized I didn't have it all together to do this task. So at 7 a.m., I called on Cynthia Parafoy. She's an environmental justice leader and expert, and who's supported the communities with her 40 years of experience working in EPA. I want to mention Connie Tucker, Tom Goldtooth, Charles Lee, Margaret Williams, Connie Tucker, Mustafa Ali, Dana Austin, Cedric Corbin Mack, and Damu Smith, because it's their shoulders that we're standing on. And we have a tradition in the BIPOC community. We acknowledge and respect our elders. And it's in that spirit that I'm mentioning these people. But in the spirit of regeneration, I want to introduce to those of you who don't know, we're very familiar with the father of environmental justice. That's Professor Robert Bullard. But I want to introduce the audience to the mother of environmental justice, Hazel Johnson. And she established the People for Community Recovery in 1979. That's in Chicago. And she was one heck of a woman. And she did a lot of work. She was there when the Executive Order 12898 was signed. And the point I want to say about regeneration is that her daughter, Cheryl Johnson, is now the director of that People of Community Recovery, and she's also serving on the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So I think it's very important that we acknowledge and recognize that we're all here because of these citizens who took on the task and their responsibility of environmental justice. And furthermore, in terms of our participation in BIPOC Scholars, this semester, my students are focused on their autobiography of their relationship, responsibility, and action to the earth. And I'm just elated that they're able to see action through this meeting. And with that, I want to introduce our panel. I'm going to call the panel names, and then I will ask the panel to respond to our question. And before they respond, to just give a little more background about themselves. Okay, so the panel The overarching theme for the BIPOC Climate Justice Dialogue is the Biden-Harris Commitment to Justice 40. Our goal is to emphasize the critical need to engage BIPOC scholars and leadership in the development and execution of strategies to address climate change. This session provides the panelists and our guests an opportunity to share how your work advances climate justice and your thoughts on ensuring that Justice 40 goals are realized. And the members of this panel are Denise Fairchild, President and CEO of Emerald Cities Collaborative, Rhiana Gunn-Wright, Climate Policy Director of the Roosevelt Institute, Ashindi Maxton, Executive Director, Donors of Color, Sherri Mitchell, Founding Director, Land Peace Foundation, and Elizabeth Yeampierre, Executive Director of UPROSE. Okay, Denise, would you like to start?
Well, no, I had hoped to be the last.
We can make you last, that's no problem.
No, that's okay. Clocking in at 6 a.m., wanting to say hello to the East Coast folks, the Eastern Centric Conference here.
Thank you so much.
But anyway, Denise Fairchild, and I want to thank you for this opportunity to be here today and to give a serious shout out to everyone, but to my HBCU family. I am, you know, my story into the environmental and energy democracy space comes out of my upbringing at Fisk University, where, you know, with W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida Wells, and John Lewis, we were trained to fight for social justice. And I struggled with the environmental movement because I see myself mostly as an economic and social justice operator, but it wasn't until, you know, almost 15 years ago now that I realized the nexus between the environment and civil rights, and bring that work through Emerald Cities Collaborative, which is a national coalition of labor, community, business organizations, and working at the intersection of environment, economy, and equity. And I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Okay, Elizabeth.
Buenos días, She, mi gente. I'm so happy to be here from the Republic of Brooklyn. I am a descendant of colonialism, of extraction. I'm a Puerto Rican woman working at the intersection of racial injustice and climate change. I run UPROSE. I'm co-chair of the Climate Justice Alliance, and I'm also wearing the hat of being on the board of trustees of the Solutions Project here today. I am so excited to see Felicia. I haven't seen you in a lifetime, and it takes a lifetime to do this transformational work that we're doing. And I'm honored to be in community with all of you today. So gracias de corazón.
Rihanna.
Hi, everyone. I'm calling in from DC, Occupy Piscataway territory. I'm really honored to be here and to be here with so many leaders in the field. I am currently the Climate Policy Director at the Roosevelt Institute. And before this, I helped develop the Green New Deal. I come at this work actually from a background in social policy. I started out my career working on welfare policy, inspired by research on the welfare rights movement, and then just through life and the fact that social policy is part of everything, moved into different areas and finally landed in climate policy. So really honored to be here, excited to have this conversation.
Okay, thank you. Ashindi?
Good morning, I'm Ashindi Maxton. I'm the Executive Director of the Donors of Color Network. I'm also on the board of Vocal USA, some of you may know. And this is the most people of color I've ever been able to be a part of who are talking about climate, and I'm feeling really inspired this morning.
Great, welcome. Sherri Mitchell.
Good morning. My name is Sherri Mitchell. Ndaliwisi Wanahamugwasit and Ajio Benawabskewi. I'm from the Penobscot Nation, and I am the Executive Director for the Land Peace Foundation, and I also sit on the board of the American Indian Institute and the Advisory Council for Yeampierre, and am one of the founders of the Wabanaki Leadership Institute. And so I am thrilled to be a part of this, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. And I'm not going to take any more time introducing myself so that we can get into the dialogue.
Okay, thank you. Elizabeth?
Yes, I just went, is there another question?
No, you're good. I
Okay.
want to make sure I've got everybody.
Good.
Okay, we do. Okay, so I would just like to start off, if you all can give a little more insight into how your work and what are your thoughts about this task that's before us, thanks to the Biden-Harris administration of investing in regenerative economies, equity, and justice. So what do you see as the intersection or intersectionality between those three? How are we going to interconnect those and do these things simultaneously or integratively? So for example, one of the things I share with my students in class is about, we call it scale and cross-scale dynamics, governance and information in a multi-level world, and how everything is interconnected through networks and jurisdictions and spatial and temporal scales. And what's been going on and how we've arrived at environmental justice, or the need for it, is because everything's been done in silos. It hasn't been looked at as a holistic perspective and a holistic approach as the context for doing the work and making policy, making laws, and making decisions, as well as teaching students. So now the Biden-Harris administration appears to be taking that perspective, that we need to look at things in a holistic perspective, and we have to approach it in a collaborative manner where everybody's at the table and under this notion of fairness, equity. But that's not what we've been doing. So we are very happy and elated that the Biden-Harris administration has taken this direction. But we're here as the BIPOC scholars to make ourselves available to assist them. So we'll be successful. So the environmental justice movement and that leadership summit, that we can stand, hopefully, as good as they were to get it all started. We want to take it over the goalpost, over the goal line, through our assistance and scholarship that we're going to offer to the Biden-Harris. So what are your thoughts on how we can do that?
I'm happy to start the conversation. I think that one of the things that is really critically important is for the administration to have some recognition of intellectual colonization and to understand that there have been a diversity of voices left out of the conversation, and that a lot of the climate change solutions that are being presented are coming from a very narrow view. And so in order to create this holistic dialogue, this holistic pathway that you just mentioned, we're going to have to look at that issue of colonization of the green, right? This green colonization that is pushing forward, that there is no consideration for other ways of knowing and other ways of being in relation to life that are being presented here. These are all still very clearly within the white male scholarship category. And so yesterday I had a conversation with two of my colleagues with over 800 climate scientists and scholars. And one of the terms that came up by Dina Gilio Whitaker was epistemicide, where all of our ways of knowing and ways of being have been completely taken out of the conversation. And so if we want to really create holistic ways of moving forward, if we want to create a pathway toward addressing climate change that's going to be fluid on the ground, then we have to address that discrepancy and the paternalization that often comes with, and the monetization of climate solutions, because we can't have a solution that's based in a capitalistic mindset if we really truly want to benefit life. And so those kinds of things, I think, need to be at the forefront of the discussion, and we have to look at what others have to offer who have not created the problem, but who have been impacted by and have been suffering the problem. Because those who have been impacted and who have been suffering the problem largely are not those responsible for creating it. And we all know that you can't solve a problem with the same tools and mindsets that created it. So I think that's where we need to begin.
Okay, thank you. Rihanna?
Yeah, I was going to say, I agree with everything that Sherri said. And I was going to say, in addition, I think something that the Biden-Harris administration is going to have to grapple with is the fact that even though they are starting to take this holistic look at what's going on, they're in structures that are not built to operate in that way. So the government is still built in a way that is very siloed. Agencies are still incredibly siloed. And so and also the sort of, as my friend John Washington likes to talk about, policy is built to be passed. It's not often built to be implemented. And so for the Justice 40 commitment to be successful, there actually has to be a level of coordination with local, state, and sub-local that hasn't existed maybe ever, and certainly hasn't been undertaken on this scale since maybe the New Deal, if you want to even think about that as local and federal coordination. So there actually has to be a lot of thought about how, and willingness to restructure within government, how they are approaching these problems, and how agencies are structured to actually allow, not even just allow, but actually implement that sort of holistic holistic sort of stance and perspective that they are trying to take. And also just having worked in DC for a while, really, as much as people talk about local and state, most folks don't actually know what happens at the local level or the state level. They have never worked there. And so for us to figure out how communities can actually, how there can be democratic control of these investments, how things can how money can actually flow to the organizations that are most connected to the community, not just the biggest nonprofits, not just the white contractors that always, bid and get the work, is going to take new forms of collaboration with new partners that I think the administration is interested in, but my sense is still there's not yet a grappling with how much has to be done to allow for the things that they have committed to.
Okay, Denise?
Well, thank you, Sherri and Rihanna, for opening us up. I could probably go down both paths at the same time, because I'm very clear that this administration, I've been sort of continuing to teach myself. I see myself as a practicing scholar, but teaching myself on Hermetic principles, and there's no real, which is 5,000 years old ancient African civilization, and how the philosophies of that civilization was really about we're all one, and that there's no conversation about us being the environment, that we're all integrated as a part of an ecosystem, and until we get there, I think this environmental movement is just a sort of a Western bastardization of what this universe really, and this cosmic reality is about. But that's a whole nother pathway. But what I want to really lift up is, on a practical level, on the ground level, how do we make Justice 40 happen? And Rihanna's absolutely right. The words, the ideas, the policies are great, but the implementation tools, the delivery mechanism do not exist. And I'm going to give you a clear example. And my emphasis is on what Professor Baker talked about this morning, is that this is our moment, and this is our opportunity to not address just our environmental and challenges, but our economic challenges as well, and to build community wealth. But the system's 100 years of infrastructure and structural barriers are getting in the way. We are working with 25 sustainability offices around the country. They're going to get the money. The states and local governments will be getting this money. They do not engage with communities. They are afraid of frontline communities and don't know how to have conversations with us. So that's the first challenge. And secondly, they don't know a thing about economic inclusion, job development, and workforce development. Those are the silos Rihanna talked about, that they live in their world, and we're trying to open them up and to actually even have some, at least minimally, just start with some interagency collaboration. Right across the street is your economic development office or your equity office. Can y'all just get along? Can you have a conversation and figure out how you actually come into community? It does not exist. And I'm telling you, we're dealing with ground zero. Secondly, then there's, so what we're seeing is in certain places that will be nameless, they're putting out, they're talking about retrofitting 7 million buildings, in many of those residential, small commercial buildings will be in our communities. And they're putting out these right now, $30 million retrofit contracts. And like Rihanna says, they're going to, the ESCOs and the large companies with no local hire, no local procurement requirements or standards built in. And then we don't have a pipeline. We have had decades and decades of divestment from our communities, not being able to grow our businesses and not be able to get our young people educated in these new pathways, that there has to be significant investment in our academic institutions and Black and Brown, Hispanic serving institutions, Black serving institutions, Native American institutions need to train our people to be in the forefront, not in the, the back of the bus, but at the forefront, the vanguard of this movement, so that we're not only cleaning up carbon-free buildings and carbon-free communities, but we are producers and makers of this clean energy future. So there's a lot to do, but I think community needs to be at the forefront to begin to build these multi-stakeholder conversations at the local level to make sure those resources come correct and that we have see ourselves in a new platform in 4 years.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, thank you for this question, the conversation about what a new kind of governance looks like and how we operationalize Justice 40 is central. This plan of Justice 40 comes out of New York. It comes out of the CLCPA, the Climate and Community Protection Act, where we basically passed legislation to move a minimum of 35% of resources to the front line to make sure that New York State is carbon neutral by 2050, to generate about 150,000 jobs, develop renewable energy, and invest in environmental justice communities. So it's modeled after the legislation in New York. And I think it's important, before we even talk about the fact that they're not having us at the table, to talk about some of the wins that our communities have experienced in just the recent years, wins in the midst of heightened racism, in the midst of COVID, and in the midst of climate change. In my community, it's been all about jobs and infrastructure and literally changing the landscape. From fighting a developer in the industrial sector, we wanted an industrial sector that would build for climate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience. They wanted high-end needs to be served and displacement. And we developed a plan called the Grid. And as a result of the Grid, which would basically make it possible for us to operationalize a just transition, we were able to attract a $200 million commitment from the state to bring in offshore wind to Sunset Park. We were able to launch the first community-owned solar cooperative in the state of New York, and we're expanding that. We were able to negotiate a deal with New York City Industrial Development Corporation for an ecosystem development project that would result in thousands of jobs that deal with everything from how you build it to supply chain. So all of these things are big, they're substantial, and they're being done and created by frontline leadership. Everything from the CLCPA to what we're proposing now, which is the CCIA, another piece of legislation to make it possible to have investments in the state of New York. And so the federal government sees us. They may not want to recognize us, but they see us, and they are literally modeling the work that we're doing. There are some problems with the Biden administration, and they have to remember that it was a broad multiracial coalition. You know, those of us on the front lines of white supremacy, economic and climate crisis that showed up in record numbers in 2018 and 2020 to elect a new Congress and the president, and that they owe us. And their plan is good. It's a good start, but it has to be much bigger, and it has to be scaled up to our crisis. The COVID relief is not enough. It's piecemeal, and limited action is not enough. And then we're also concerned that the Biden administration, when we know that just last year, there was a dedication of $10 billion appropriated for fall solutions like carbon capture and storage and carbon capture utilization and sequestration, that this administration is doubling down on fossil fuel-backed, unproven mechanisms that hurt our communities. So our communities have the solutions. We're operationalizing it. We're creating legislation. We're doing base building. We are literally not only transforming the landscape by putting infrastructure in the ground, we're building leadership. And we are creating the models that can be replicated throughout the United States. So our solutions have to be centered in any kind of decision-making, and the time for sort of top-down, grass-tops decision-making is over. So when Rihanna is talking about governance, I feel that. I feel that because climate change is demanding a different kind of governance, one with shared power, one that is leaderful, one that sees communities as partners at the table and not passive recipients of good intentions or people that have to be managed by people in governance. We won't survive if that model, that patriarchal model of leadership within the federal administration becomes a replica of past administrations. So there's a lot that we can do together, but we have to do it together, and the learning has to come from the ground. It has to come from people of African and indigenous ancestry who have been bearing the brunt of a legacy of environmental racism for generations and are now really shaping how we move forward. So I'm excited about this conversation because what we have is a vast number of solutions, and some of them have been tested, and we've got tremendous wins even in the midst of despair. So, so I'm happy to continue this conversation.
Thank you. Ashindi?
Well, I am the newest to the climate space, and as such, I want to take a second to just back up and introduce the Donors of Color Network that I represent, which is also new to climate work, and new in the world. So, the Donors of Color Network is the first cross-racial community of people of color with high net worth who want to fund systemic racial justice. So that is what we were born to do. We're 2 years old. In thinking about the question of how do you build systemic racial justice and power for people of color in a cross-racial way, climate pretty quickly rose to the top of our agenda for two reasons. One is people of color being the front face of climate change. The second being exactly what Elizabeth said, which is that the systems that got us here will not save us, and an understanding that there is a tectonic shift that has to happen. And it's actually not about inclusion. We think it's absolutely about centering the communities who have the solutions. Like, we will not win on climate any other way. And the role that we believe philanthropy has to play is enforcing government, enforcing government and resourcing the communities that actually have the answers. Government's going to do right by communities of color on climate when we make it. It's not passively gonna do the right thing for us. So we believe that philanthropy can be, one, risk capital in building new models that government learns from, as Elizabeth mentioned, like if we get it right, like we can teach government to get it right. Two, resourcing the organizations that, hold government accountable. Three, scaling the solutions that we have, understanding that our communities have solutions inside of them, and that our lived experience is its own form of expertise. So to that end, we have worked with Danielle, Dean Ryan, and been incredibly lucky to have her as our climate strategist, helping us create the Climate Funders Justice Pledge, which is our invitation to the broader field of funding to say, right now, as far as we know, 1.3% of funding is going to organizations and leaders of color. 1.3%, that's the best stat we have. Let's say we're off by a factor of 10. It's still so immoral and so far from what it would look like to win on climate by including and centering the communities that we believe have the answers. So the Climate Funders Justice Pledge looks at the field of funders and asks them to sign on to committing to 30% of their funding going to organizations led by and accountable to communities of color. And we've made a list on our website of regional and national networks that we think millions could flow to immediately. And two, we are asking them to be transparent. We understand that racial equity was somewhat on trend, in 2020. We want to institutionalize that and say, what does it look like to say that you commit to racial equity when that lands in a budget and when you make it a permanent part of your institution? And we believe that looks like making a 30% metric, continuing to report on it publicly, and then making sure that all the folks on this call, have the resourcing that you need to do the work that you do, because it's what's really been missing in having scale in the climate fight.
Okay, very good. What I wanted to, in terms of what you all have responded, I want to sort of come back to one point, a couple of the points that I've heard. One of the main points that was raised was that despite the effort and the commitment by the Biden-Harris administration, that the government itself, the infrastructure of the government, is not designed, it's not organized, it's not receptive to that initiative. Even if they were committed, the structure is not there, the infrastructure is not there to accomplish this task. What's your thoughts about how to make that happen? How to assist the government and get them more receptive to being more responsive to changing their infrastructure, or how they operate, how they communicate with each other inside the government and with the citizens of the country, especially the people under the rubric of climate and environmental justice impacts, disproportionate impacts.
Well, let me try to respond to that if I can. First, I want to say that the 40% investment is not enough.
Okay.
that at a minimum, we have to be advocating to increase investment to front lines to at least 50% to move away from fossil fuels so that we can invest in affordable community and tribal owned renewable energy systems, safe and clean water and wastewater sanitation systems. We need to make sure that we say that because we think that 40% is the base. It's not the ceiling. It should not be the ceiling, considering the legacy of extraction in our communities and how it's ended up literally in our cells, which is why we're so susceptible to COVID. In terms of the federal government, there is interagency coordination has always been a big failure. And if they're talking about moving resources for infrastructures and moving investments, there has to be a system of monitoring, of tracking those resources so that good ideas don't go to OMB to die. There has to be an internal audit that each of these agencies has, not just because, and this is what I witnessed under the Obama administration when I was chair of the NEJAC, is that you could bring in leadership with a vision and the intention to do something radical and different. But you've got hundreds of people who work at these agencies that move the cogs very slowly and may be compromised politically. How do you engage in an audit to make sure that they are reaching those marks, that they're moving the agenda on behalf of our communities, and that they are interacting with us in a way that makes sense? Agencies don't talk to each other. And so you've got the Department of Energy, hopefully under Shalanda, everything's different. And I'm super hopeful and psyched about that. But you've got these agencies not talking to the 17 National Institutes of Health. And you've got the Department, the EPA not engaged with DOI. Issues in our communities are complex. And so the responses and the allocation of resources and the decision-making, the regulatory framework, all of that has to be as complex and requires that these agencies work with each other in a way that complements each other. And so that they can address these complex issues and engage community and center racial justice and equity. What happens instead is that they create advisory groups that are sort of what have been these dog and pony shows that show up at communities like they did, like the Council of Environmental Quality did back in the day. and listen to communities, but don't report back on how they have integrated recommendations that are coming from the front line. That has to change. That has to change radically. And so not just the relationship with us, but the relationship with each other, the allocation of resources, how it's monitored, how it's assessed, and how they, and a system of transparency and accountability that doesn't exist right now. And so those are the things that I would offer. I know it's a big lift, but if this administration wants to engage in a departure from past practices that have kept us moving slowly, and literally moving slowly, injustice costs us lives, they're going to have to rethink what governance looks like.
The only thing I would add to that, Elizabeth, that was great, is that I saw a great chart the other day, which really talked about people living in safe spaces, doing what they know how to do and have historically done, which is not giving us the solutions that we need, and those that live in anxiety spaces, which is our communities. This is us, we're economically stressed and climate stressed and educational stress, and that there's a space in between, which is really about the learning community that should be the center around which change happens, and that learning community should be driven by frontline communities and communities of color, where we live in these in this holistic world. We do have solutions because we live the problems and bring in to people that live in these safe spaces into our world, and through at least through a conversation, so that they know how to look under their own hoods to figure out what's wrong with this engine, right? And how do we tinker with the parts of this engine that's not been working historically in the past. So I don't know how, and I'm pushing this as a element of building a social capital, right? That doesn't exist, and a new sensibility that has to happen, but it doesn't occur without direct engagement, intentional engagement, and conversation, not from the top down, but from the bottom up.
I would also like to add that I think that we need to have real talk about, large conglomerate stakeholders really running the show, and that, we have these large stakeholders who are operating behind the scenes, pulling all of the puppet strings, so that any progress that's made toward renewable energy, any progress that's made toward improving health outcomes for impacted communities is systematically stopped. That there are literal brakes put in the cogs of those wheels, which is why they are turning so slowly. And we've risen to the place where, or sunk to the place, I should say, where realistically every agency has its own type of political agenda, and that political agenda is based on the special interests of the people in charge. And what are the interests of that individual? What are the alliances of that individual? Who are they beholden to in their career? And so when you have the fox guarding the hen house, you're going to just keep seeing dead chickens, right? And this is what's been going on for far too long. And so we need to move from optics to action. I mean, one of the things that I think is most challenging for us right now is to break up these monopolies that are being run by these large-scale stakeholders, and to begin to localize the efforts of those who are most ready, most capable, and most impacted by the issues that need to be changed, because they have the greatest motivation to do so. And so if we really hope to move ourselves into action, we need to be able to look realistically and talk realistically about what it is that's stopping us, because we know that this is what's stopping us. And we don't say it often enough in public places where there's a capacity to change that. And so how do we change that is the biggest question before us, because we have the means, we have the skills, right? We have the desire to create the change. We just have to move what's stopping us from creating that change out of the way first. And I think that's our real first step.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I agree with everything that's been said. Elizabeth brought up some incredible points. I would add that um, I think part of it is also recognizing that Justice 40 reaches across all of climate policy, not just what people think of as environmental justice, quote unquote, investments. So I just had a conversation the other day, and it was clear that we were talking about the American Jobs Plan, infrastructure plan that the Biden-Harris administration just put out. And it was clear that the person that I was talking to thought about, removing all lead pipes as part of Justice 40, but didn't think about the way that the financing to encourage the deployment of clean energy, that they didn't think of that as part of Justice 40, right? And so I think that again, that type of siloing exists even in the way that people think about different policies. So part of, I think, what has to happen is thinking about designing all of the climate policies with Justice 40 in mind, right? So the clean energy standard that people are very excited about, that could have huge implications for questions of 40% investment going to frontline communities. That has to be designed in a way that supports Justice 40. Same with the ways that we incentivize or finance clean energy, right? There's the 27 billion dollar accelerator. Is that going to be at the federal level? Is that going to be localized? Like how is that structured? We're talking about tax credits, using tax credits to move financing, but we don't talk about who those tax credits are available to, the ways that those are designed that can affect uptake. So all of that, I think, when we talk about changing the way that we do governance, it's also about policy design and designing all of the policies, not just what people think of as environmental justice investments, with Justice 40 in mind, or else you end up with, honestly, something really janky. Just parts all out of alignment, not working together. But I think we're still in a place where, again, the commitments are great. It's a great start, but people still want to shrink what this means in a way that could very negatively affect communities.
But I'd like to lift that up and even Sherri's point further, which is the question of our environmental challenges are truly not environmental issues, they're economic issues. Is a question of, is this the moment that we keep talking about for dismantling capitalism, right? That we're consumers. We're an economy of mass production and mass consumption and a mass accumulation of wealth, and all we're doing is just greening that right now, right? And trying to split up the pie a little bit more, a little bit better. When are we as communities that live this really think about and use this moment to talk about a new kind of economy that is gonna, we are what, 5% in the West, 5% of the population, and pollute 25% of the carbon emission and use 23% of the biodiversity. That's criminal. And we're part of the problem. We're just as much, into shopping and driving and wanting the big houses, and we see that our energy consumption is no longer just about basic needs, for food and water. Using it, it's really increasingly 23% for discretionary energy. The trips that we take and the boats or the vacations, blah blah blah. Discretionary. So when do we really pull back the covers on this and look at what's underneath and see what we do to fix it now?
So it's your point is that we've got the government, we've got the corporate folks, but you're asking the question, posing the question, where do we fit in this picture? What responsibility and actions can we take in thinking about our own behavior, what we're doing with our own economic resources in order to move into this new kind of economy and to have those kind of talks, to see what's coming, because a change is coming. So that's the other point. Climate justice, EJ justice, Justice 40. But as Rihanna said, there's other things going on that we're not even talking about. They're talking about going to, for example, what is it called? The digital currency. You don't have money, you just, it's all whatever on the cards or whatever. Even the Federal Reserve and all those big people are having these conversations. So the economy is changing under this current infrastructure, as we call it. But we're talking about trying to flip it or improve it from this perspective. So do you think there's a need to, what I'm hearing is said that we can't talk about this topic only within the context of our perspective in space as people of color and being impacted? I think what's missing also, because the conversation sort of puts this over there and it's only those people that are being impacted. And we sort of dissociate from the fact that the United States have one of the worst health outcomes among developed countries in the world. Education, terrible. When you do the measures and the ratings. And then when we talk about environmental and health, it's not people of color that account for all the heart disease and all the diabetes and all the autism. So it seems to me there is this thing where they say, well, that's just the Black folks, that's just Hispanic folks, so I don't have to worry about it. And maybe, so what is your thought about that, of broaden this picture and telling the whole story? Everybody's being impacted. The communities we're talking about is the ground zero.
I feel triggered.
Go ahead.
You know,
I
have diabetes. I have high blood pressure. I almost died from COVID a year ago. This week, lost 4 members of my family, was born and raised in EJ communities. I know that it is our people that are not contributing to climate change. Regardless of our consumption culture, we're talking about corporate polluters. We're talking about a small percentage of people who have put us in harm's way. Climate change was birthed by capitalism, by the extraction of our land and our labor. It was birthed by the enslavement of our people. So I get worried sometimes when people start talking about how we are the ones responsible. Certainly we have power when it comes to consumption, but we're really talking about a system, an economic system that has put us here and has been built on the backs and the lives of our people. The cemeteries are filled with our community. So I want to make sure that, because often people say, well, you know, environmental justice for all. And I'm not talking about everybody. I'm talking about the people who have historically been literally destroyed as a result of a legacy of extraction on the backs of our communities, and they have to be prioritized. So I just want to say that, because language is really important, and we're in this historical place right now where it isn't just the Justice 40. We're talking about several pieces of legislation, you know, the inclusion of legislation for a just transition, like the End Polluter Welfare Act that was penned by Omar and Sanders to end fossil fuel subsidies, the Energy Resilient Communities Act by Barragan and Clark to build 100% clean energy microgrids and environmental justice communities and tribal and indigenous communities, and the Keep It in the Ground, which is forthcoming from Merkley. All of these are important because our communities are basically creating local livable economies. They're moving away from extraction, and we're talking about how we move away from capitalism, because we know that capitalism is literally killing the planet. I try not to be judgmental about our people liking things, because I also know that we never had things, and that because we never had things, yeah, we like that pocketbook and that new pair of shoes, because it's kind of narcotizes us, right? It makes it possible for us to get through a legacy of not having had things. So I try not to judge our people, while at the same time making sure that our communities understand the connection between their health disparities, their livability, and these policies and these practices that corporations have created for us. If you look at a place like Africa and you look at the River Niger and you see that that river has been contaminated for generations, creating disease, creating hardship, creating despair and death as a result of US corporations and other European corporations who have had their way with people in the African continent. The same thing throughout the global South and in our communities, whether it's Puerto Rico or whether we're talking about the Gulf South, it's our communities. And so right now we're in this historical moment where we can pass legislation, hold these people that we've elected accountable, make sure that the resources are being moved to the front line, and that we are building something that we imagine. And so I think that we're there. I think we're in that place. And so I wanna stay in that place of being solution oriented, because anything else will kill the spirit. And the truth is that we are actually doing these things. We're putting infrastructure in the ground, we're reducing carbon, we're eliminating co-pollutants, and we're trying to build healthier communities. And all of those other things are central. If you're talking about racial justice and climate change, you're talking about housing, unemployment, criminalization. I've been upset this week over the legalization of marijuana in New York, because already they're making it cost prohibitive for people who are Black and brown to be able to set up their businesses, despite the fact that generations of our people have been incarcerated because of marijuana. So yeah, at the end, and central to all of this is the fact that this is a country that is racist, and that it shows up literally in every piece of legislation. And the speed at which we move is meant to accommodate and make comfortable the privilege in this country. So we need to move quickly. We need to demand a lot. We put these people in office, and we need to start also taking language apart. You know, they're talking about benefits, and we're talking about actual investments in EJ communities. And there's a big difference between investments and benefits. Benefits can be easily appropriated by the private sector and polluting industries. So we have to insist that at least 50% of investments go into our communities. So I'm sorry, when you started talking about consumption, I was like, you know, sometimes I need those.
We've got to be clear.
Sometimes I need those issues.
We got to be real clear that the BIPOC values, that we need to lead with our values, and our values are not Western values of consumption. They're
Absolutely.
about family. They're about community.
Yes.
They're about
Yes.
collective economics, and that is we are the leaders in this, and we need to bring our values to the forefront.
I agree, totally.
I also just want to mention one thing about, you know, the bearing the brunt, right? Like, we're expected to bear the brunt of the harms that we've already, you know, of the solutions when we've already borne all the brunt of the harms. And another thing that worries me is that, you know, there's all this talk about 80% of the remaining untouched lands being in Indigenous hands. That could target us for further taking. And so, you know, we have to be really careful how we talk about this within our communities, and have a lot of nuance in our discussions, that our values forward, but really being mindful about what burden we're placing upon ourselves in regard to the movement forward. So thank you both for those comments.
Ashindi?
Yes, I just really wanted to underscore, stand completely behind everything that Elizabeth had to say, and also add, you know, my piece of the answer to the last question was really about who's in the room and who is at the decision-making table. And I want Elizabeth at the decision-making table when, you know, things are being crafted. I want Rihanna there when policies are being made. And, you know, so stepping back and saying, what does it take for us to be in those places, so that we are holding the power to write the legislation, to make the radical decisions about an economy, to ask the questions about who benefits because we've lived it. So I think about two things. You know, one is political power. So, you know, the idea that we are underrepresented in the same ways in philanthropy as we are in political power. So just to give one stat, you know, comparable to the one that we use, the 1.3% of funding going to communities of color from the climate funders movement. When you look at contractors to the Democratic Party, they are similarly 1.9% people of color, or were the last time it was studied. And so the people that the Democratic Party sees are white folks. Like, that's who they know how to talk to. They know how to talk to their own friends and family. They have imagination about white swing voters and Trump supporters that they want to turn, because that is what their world is. And so when you change any part of the system, start with the decision makers. Like, who are the people who get to make the decisions? And for me, it has a lot to do with change the decision makers who influence where the resources flow, so that you can have everyone, people who represent Elizabeth's lived experience, people who represent Sherri's lived experience at the table, at scale, with full power to change completely what the outcomes look like. And I think that's, sort of in government and across the board. And I do want to lift up one other talking point from the Climate Funders Justice Pledge that we have at Donors of Color. Danielle, Dean, and I spend a lot of time right now talking to foundation presidents and staff. And one of the, we do like up to 3 or 4 of these meetings a day. And so we get to hear directly from the people who are in the decision-making positions and what their barriers in their own minds are. And there's any number of them. But one of them is lack of imagination about us. They don't know us because they're not us. It's almost all white men, sometimes white women, very few exceptions. And 2, they don't have any sense of what people of color bring that helps us win. So they have a lot of ideas of like, sort of, they picture protests and still haven't pictured that like, it's actually only when we do the protests and direct action that you can create the political will to change and win on climate for bold policy. But they don't think about academics. They don't think about scientists. They don't think about all of the other ways you can fund people of color where the lived experience matters. And one of the examples that I've been lifting up to them is, who do you think just saved democracy in this country? It was
again.
But very visibly this time, right? Like when our democracy came down to a few states, it was people of color in Arizona, Black people in Georgia, it was people of color in Pennsylvania who were the margin of difference. And had civic engagement funders not discovered those communities in the last 10 years and begun to resource them, we would have lost that election. We would have, and like it would have changed the fate of this country permanently if somebody had not started resourcing those communities to do their own work in their own place, in and out of cycle, not in a parachute model, well before that happened, because we know what we need. Like, we are here, and like when we are winning, everyone's winning. And so we're trying to make that same argument to climate funders right now, which is, you're not winning because you haven't resourced the communities that have the most on the line, but also who have the most expertise. And if you want to win, this is a leverage point that you must engage, and like anything else is irrational, and anything else is white supremacy.
Okay, so we thank you. We have 5 minutes left on our session, and the Biden-Harris administration has 4 years, at least as far as we know right now, and moving Justice 40 forward. So what are your thoughts and recommendations on what should be the priority of operationalizing this effort?
I would love to jump in first because Elizabeth brought up benefits of investment versus investment. And I actually think that is one of the most crucial parts. Doing from sort of just thinking about the administration of the federal government, like we talked about how siloed it is, 40% of investments is already sort of logistically a nightmare in lots of ways. Just figuring out, how do you figure out who the communities are, getting the definitions on the books, all the way to how do you get 40% through the budget process, all these things. It's a lot of work. It's all doable, but it's a lot of work. 40% of the benefits of investment takes control even further away from communities and introduces the possibility of all sorts of nonsense. That means that even less money is flowing to our communities. And that is really dangerous. And my understanding is the benefits of investment language came from actually Governor Cuomo wanting to water down what was happening in the the demand from New York renews. And
Right.
it's unclear if the administration wants to do the same thing. It seems like they don't. It seems like there's just not an understanding of the differences maybe, but those two things are very different. And when it comes to moving 40% of the benefits of investment, I am very afraid. One, who's defining benefits? I'm just very afraid it's going to look very different. I also agree with Elizabeth. I work to help support the Thrive Act, which calls for 50%. It should absolutely be 50% of investment. But those, again, we talked about language matters. Language really matters when
Yep.
you're talking about investments versus benefits of investment, and just the world of nonsense that benefit of investments opens you up to, especially knowing the ways that corporate actors move, the amount of power that they have in these processes, the fact that truly the GOP, they have a wonderful understanding of the regulatory state and how to manipulate it. And so I just worry very deeply about what we are introducing when we talk about the benefits of investment, which is a language that's in the American Jobs Plan. That's what the
Right.
administration has said, versus investment, because it is not the same thing.
The only thing I would add is that I really think we only have 6 months to put handcuffs on the dollars that'll be coming down. You know, they live in political time horizons, and you know, midterm. They're looking at midterms already, and whether they're going to lose the House, et cetera, et cetera. So let's figure out how we get as much handcuffs and language and requirements embedded in it. But the real work is going to be us on the front line in communities, holding our cities and states accountable, because the money will be coming primarily to cities and states. And so we've got to be in their faces and making certain that, first of all, if we get the handcuffs on, that they keep them on, and then to otherwise get communities resources, investments directly into communities. This is going to be a ground game at the end of the day.
Yeah. I would just add that we have a once in a generation chance for Congress to pass a transformational economic recovery, rebuilding and infrastructure package, the Thrive Act, which Rihanna mentioned. It would put 15 million people to work in good, family-sustaining climate jobs and care jobs, delivering real community-led climate solutions that advance racial, indigenous, gender, health, and economic justice. And just finally, that the 40% investment just won't cut it. At a minimum, we're advocating to increase investment to frontlines to at least 50% and move away from fossil fuels. And then there's those other pieces of legislation. So there's a lot there for us to work with. And we just need to be able to hold the line and remind the administration, as they invest in fossil fuel-backed companies, that we were the ones that put them there. And we have expectations for accountability and for them to deliver on their promises.
Okay, well, I want to extend much thanks and appreciation to the panel for making us aware and informing us and being on the front lines of what is a regenerative economy and how that is really where we should go, but it should be about the people who are impacted the most being at the table, because they have the knowledge, they have the solutions, they have the experience. And I really want to thank, I think it was Denise, who talked about anxiety spaces, safe spaces, and the learning community. And that the learning community was should be that interface between those two spaces. So I'm looking forward to more of these discussions. And again, we thank everyone for their wise wisdom, thoughts, and insights. Thank you again.
Every sunrise that makes our lives possible is a reminder of our sacred responsibility to care for creation and one another with life-giving compassion.